Tonight, we step back to the darkest age in Europe, when a single flea could change your fate, and hope was found in crushed herbs and whispered prayers. If you love cozy bedtime history, hit like, subscribe, and ring that bell so you never miss our nightly journeys into the past. Now, snuggle in, and let's discover how medieval souls tried to survive the Black Death, with remedies half known and faith fully held. Chapter 1. The Whisper on the Wind. Soft, ambient lute music. Distant church bells toll twice. A gentle breeze stirs laundry on a line. Good evening, dreamers. Imagine it's a clear spring morning in 1348. The sun peeks over whitewashed rooftops. Smoke curls from chimneys. You step into the town square where life hums clamor at the fishmonger's stall. Children chasing a hoop. A pair of old friends arguing over which loaf of bread is freshest. This is any ordinary day in a thriving medieval town. Folks greet each other with nods and smiles. Market stalls shout their wares. Fresh apples, warm cheese, hot mead for your aching bones. And above it all, the church bells ring out 9 o'clock mass, or perhaps a funeral. You can never quite tell, but they're part of the soundtrack. A normal day, with unusual footsteps. As you wander past the fish stall, you notice something odd. The fishermen's nets sit empty, despite baskets of silver-skinned herring lined up on the quay. A few sailors stand huddled by the docks, wide-eyed. One shakes his head without speaking. You catch snatches of their hushed conversation. They found the crew, dead in their bunks. All of them, no sign of injury, just cold. You glance toward the harbor, where 2 small trading ships bob in the tide. Rats huge bold scurry along the rails. One tumbles into the water, pops out like a furry seal, and scuttles ashore. Dozens more pour down the gangplank, scattering into the town's nooks and crannies. Rats at the docks. Unusual, startling, but in a busy port, maybe not unheard of. You shrugged, hoping it's just a ship with poor vermin control. After all, spices are expensive, but rat traps aren't cheap either. Rumors ripple through the streets by mid-morning. The gossip mill roars to life. A mother tucks her child's chin in with extra care as she whispers to a neighbor. They say the men fell ill so quickly. Fever, buboes, a day to death. The blacksmith pauses mid-swing, brow furrowed, listening to the barkeep's tale. A family in Essex, 8 in one house, all gone before the priest could say amen. You see a nun cross herself on the corner. You hear a merchant mutter, pestilence, like it's an old friend walking into town unannounced. And the rumor train picks up speed. At the cathedral steps, a local clerk reads out a notice: ships arriving from far-off lands must be fumigated. Their crew quarantined, boiling vinegar and thyme, the length of 3 weeks. Some scoff, others nod, and cross a finger over their rosary beads. Whispers move faster than the town crier's bell. From port to parish, from the alehouse to the apothecary, everyone shares the same question. What is this sickness? That faint chill before panic by noon. An undercurrent of unease has settled over the town like mist in the fields. You feel it in your bones, a slight tremor of fear when you pass the miller, who coughs into his sleeve. You sense it in the hush over the children's laughter, the way the butcher wipes his cleaver and looks away. Market stalls still stand, but fewer coins change hands. That perfectly ripe peach, too risky. Better to buy oats than risk a visit to the infirmary. The church bells toll again, perhaps for midday prayers, perhaps for the village that inched closer to despair. You hear the rhythm of the town change, the steady pulse of normal life growing erratic, like a stopped clock trying to tick again. And you understand, deep down, today's ordinary is about to end. The calm before the storm. You wander to the well, draw water, and wash your hands. The water's cool, sweet. You drink deeply, hoping it's not laced with doom. At your back, a rat scampers off, carrying a crumb twice its size. You chuckle nervously. Rats with crumbs. Now that's a sight. But then you remember, they're fleeing death aboard those ships. Maybe they know something you don't. The day winds down. Smoke from chimneys darkens the sky. Lanterns flicker. Along the streets, families light candles at their hearths. And children, once playing tag, now whisper through open windows. Did you hear they sealed the quay? Yes. 3 more ships came in, and no one let them dock. I saw a cart take bodies out at dawn. A shiver runs through you, not from the cool evening air, but from the realization that the world you knew warm, bustling, safe is being replaced by something fearsome and unknown. A bedtime promise. For tomorrow, tonight, as you settle into your straw-filled mattress, you feel the hush of the coming darkness. One candle remains lit by your bedside, its flame flickering like the last hope you hold in your heart. Whispers swirl around you. Pray for mercy. Lock the doors. May the saints protect us. And you whisper back, in a calm voice, meant to steady your mind, we will face this together one dawn at a time. Sleep draws you in. The rats pause outside your window. The church bell tolls once more, a solemn note in the night. And as you drift into dreams, you carry with you the gentle promise that with the morning's light, you will learn the remedies, the prayers, and the courage needed to stand against the storm that is the Black Death. Chapter 2. The Plague Unveiled. Soft medieval wind sounds. A single bell tolls in the distance. Then silence. Let's say you wake up in your thatched-roof cottage one morning, ready to feed the chickens, stretch your legs, maybe gossip about Father Bernard's new haircut. Life, as always, smells faintly of mud and onions. Except today, something's off. Your neighbor's boy to me, he didn't show up to chase geese at dawn. His mother, she's not hanging laundry like usual. In fact, the house next door is quiet. Too quiet. And then, someone whispers the word that nobody wants to say. Plague. When buboes came knocking now, medieval folks didn't have Google. They didn't scroll Reddit for symptoms. But they knew when something wasn't right. And with this, it was very not right. It started small, fever, chills, like a really bad cold. But then came the pain. The awful, twisting, fiery neuroblood pain. Your head pounded, your stomach turned, and then bam, there they were. The buboes, swollen, lumps, big, black or purple, rising under your arms, on your neck, in your groin, hot to the touch, pulsing, oozing. Honestly, it looked like your lymph nodes were trying to escape your body. And who could blame them? These weren't little I need nap sick days. People went from fine to dying fast. Sometimes in a day too, if they were lucky. Parents buried children. Children buried parents, and entire households went silent. What did the experts think? All right, let's check in with the medical professionals of the time. Spoiler, it's a mixed bag. Most of what doctors knew came from ancient guys like Hippocrates and Galen, big names from back when the Roman Empire was still showing off. They had great ideas like, the body has 4 humors: blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile. Keep them balanced, and you'll be fine. So when the plague hit, what did they suggest? Bleeding patients. Because losing blood always cheers people up, right? Applying leeches, nature's little vampires. Drinking vinegar. For balance. Apparently, avoiding sad people. Because, sure, depression is contagious. To be fair, they were trying. But most of their advice sounded like the result of a bad dream after too much cheese. There were also medical manuals, little books filled with recipes like, take crushed emeralds, mix with wine, drink under a waning moon, or rub herbs into the soles of your feet, then burn a goat. No goats were safe. Not in 1348. Heaven help us. Literally, since doctors were kind of just guessing, folks turned to something even bigger, God. If you asked most villagers why this was happening, they had a simple answer. We made God angry. Sin, they believed, had stacked up too high. Greed, lust, pride, dishonesty, forgetting to kneel during Mass, gossiping about Brother Edwin's snoring. God was watching, and now he was punishing. Priests thundered from pulpits, repent, fast, pray harder, whip yourselves, confess your sins, and maybe, he'll spare your family. This led to a wave of what we might call medieval panic religion. People walked barefoot from town to town, beating themselves with leather straps, singing hymns, and begging for forgiveness. They were called the flagellants, and if you saw them in the street, covered in blood and chanting in Latin, it probably didn't help your plague anxiety. Panic with a side of paranoia as the sickness spread. People got desperate, and desperate people looked for someone to blame. Whispers became accusations. Witches, Jews poisoned the wells. It's foreigners, heretics, bad omens. Suddenly, black cats were evil. Sorry, whiskers. Women with herbs were burned. Outsiders were chased from towns. And if you coughed in public, you might get stoned before you got a second breath. It was chaos, wrapped in fear, dipped in superstition. Some believed the plague was carried by bad air, so they walked around with flowers jammed in their noses or wore creepy beaked masks filled with herbs. Yes, That's where the classic plague doctor mask came from. Others believed planets had aligned in a bad way. Astrology took a hit. Mars was definitely blamed. The moment it got real at some point, each town had its moment. That instant when everyone stopped pretending it was just a bad season. Maybe it was the day 3 entire families were found lifeless in their homes. Maybe it was the sight of a priest collapsing mid-prayer, or the sound of church bells ringing non-stop for an entire day. So many funerals, so many graves. In that moment, fear settled in people's stomachs like a heavy stone. This wasn't just illness, this was the plague. Closing thought. When the air changed so, imagine you're back in your home, watching shadows flicker across the wooden beams. A candle burns low beside you. You can still hear the market, but it's quieter now. The stalls are fewer. The laughter is gone. You feel it in your chest, that eerie stillness, like the whole town is holding its breath. Something terrible has come, and no one doctor, priest, king, or child can stop it. But you're still here listening, waiting, learning. And in the next chapter, we'll open the door to what happened after the panic hit full speed. The scramble for remedies, the rise of strange healers, and the quiet hope whispered in the dark. Chapter 3. The plague doctor's costume. Soft footsteps echo on cobblestone. Faint wind. Somewhere, a bell tolls once. Then silence. All right, picture this. You're lying in bed with a fever that makes your bones feel like they're boiling. Your neighbor hasn't been seen in 2 days. Your aunt's house smells weird. And just when you think things can't get any stranger, he shows up. A figure in black, from head to toe, wearing a wide-brimmed hat, gloves, long cloak, and, wait, is that a beak? Yup, it's the infamous plague doctor. And no, he's not here to rob a bird museum. He's here to save your life, or at least, try. Let's break it down. A beak full of hope. And herbs. That giant creepy mask wasn't just a fashion statement. The beak was stuffed with all sorts of strong-smelling herbs and flowers. Rose petals, lavender, mint, cloves, even chunks of ambergris, which is basically whale bath, but expensive. Why? Because people back then believed in the theory of sickness came from bad air. So if you smelled something nasty, it meant danger. And if you blocked your nose with nice smells, boom, safe. The beak was like a medieval air purifier, except wearable, and very, very cursed looking. Honestly, if your doctor showed up today in a leather bird mask, you'd run. But back then, people were relieved to see it, because that meant anyone was still brave or crazy enough to try and help. Cloaked in leather, for a reason the rest of the outfit was like a walking hazmat suit. Long waxed leather cloak, gloves, boots, and even goggles sometimes. Why so covered up? They were trying to avoid touching the plague. Since they didn't fully understand germs, they figured if you avoided touching sick people, or their breath, or their sweat, you might be okay. So they wrapped themselves up like a Halloween sausage and hoped for the best. Also, leather was easier to clean. In theory, just wipe off the pus and keep it moving. Not super effective, but hey, they tried. What did they carry? Plague doctors didn't just come with ominous fashion choices. They came with props. In their little leather pouches or worn satchels, you'd find things like a stick, sometimes called a cane, to poke or lift clothes without touching patients, sometimes to keep people back, sometimes to swat fleas, posies, or herbs, held in hand or stuffed in pockets. Bonus scent boost, vinegar-soaked sponges to breathe through, ointments, and weird salves, often made from things like crushed emeralds, garlic, or goat fat. Sometimes they had charts and tally books to record who had died, who was sick, and who had miraculously recovered. Spoiler, not many. They were like walking apothecaries, just ones who looked like crows and smelled like herb gardens. A day in the life of a plague doctor. So what did their job actually look like? Step 1. Enter town, get stared at, terrify children, start walking toward the houses with the painted red X's on the doors. Plague here. Step 2. Knock. Or don't. Just walk in. Step 3. Examine the patient from a distance. Mutter something about imbalanced humors. Apply garlic to the feet and hope for the best. If the person died, take notes. If they lived, miracle. Step 4. Clean your mask with vinegar. Walk to the next house and repeat. These doctors were part healer, part record keeper, part symbol of hope, and sometimes part death omen. Because in some towns, when the plague doctor came, it usually meant someone wasn't walking out alive. Did it actually work? Not really. The outfit didn't protect them from the bacteria that caused the Black Death, Yersinia pestis, because they didn't know bacteria existed yet. Fleas, rats, coughing it, all went right through that stylish leather barrier. Some plague doctors got sick anyway. Others survived, but not because of the costume. Mostly due to luck or distance from heavily infected zones. Still, it was the best guess they had, and in a weird way, it offered something just as important as medicine: reassurance. Because when everything's falling apart, when your neighbors are dying, your priests are panicking, and the sky feels heavy, it helps. Just to see someone walking calmly down the street, even if they're dressed like a spooky bird. Comfort. In a terrifying package, you might think the beak mask was terrifying, and yeah, it kind of was. But to medieval people, it meant that someone still cared. It meant the city hadn't given up, that there was still some kind of order, even if it came with leather gloves and a nose full of cloves. Kids whispered about them. Town criers gave updates when one arrived, and artists years later immortalized that beak in drawings, woodcuts, and stories. The mask became the face of the plague. Not the rats, not the buboes, the birdman. Final thought. The strange power of a costume. So tonight, as the candlelight flickers and the wind hums through the cracks in the shutters, imagine this: you're scared, alone, feverish, and suddenly a silhouette appears in the doorway. Black hat, leather coat, moonlight glinting off a long curved beak, and somehow you feel a little less alone, because someone's still walking, still showing up, still trying, no matter how strange they look. Chapter 4. Quiet prayers at dawn. Soft Gregorian chants fade in, wind rustling. A distant bell chimes 3 times. Then quiet. Before the panic, before the horses clatter down the road, before another name gets whispered in fear, there's a moment. A quiet one. It's the hour just before dawn, when the sky is still dark, but starting to shift from ink to ash, when the cold is sharp, but not cruel, when even the rats seem to pause. And in this fragile sliver of time, something gentle happens. They pray. In the monasteries, the echo of matins deep in stone abbeys, behind thick walls and heavy doors, monks are waking, not with alarm clocks or birdsong, but with bells slow, heavy ones. It's time for matins, the first of the daily prayers, usually sometime between 2 a.m. and sunrise, because sleep, apparently, was optional. They rise from stiff wooden cots, wrap themselves in woolen habits, and shuffle into cold halls lit only by flickering candles. No small talk, no yawning, just quiet footsteps and breath in the cold. Then they begin, chanting slow, low, ancient. Their voices echo off stone walls, carrying words they've said 1,000 times. Psalms, lamentations, pleas for mercy. And on nights when the plague crept closer, those prayers carried a new weight. Deliver us, O Lord, from pestilence, fire, and sudden death. Some sang because they believed it could stop the sickness, others because it was the only thing they still knew how to do. And in that flickering candlelight, surrounded by death, they found something close to peace. At home, whispered rosaries and shaky hands. Not everyone had a monastery nearby. Most folks, they had a wooden cross above their bed, a worn rosary looped around their fingers, maybe a little icon tucked in the wall. And as the first light began to bloom over the horizon, they whispered their prayers, not out loud, just enough for the words to count. Some begged for healing, some begged for protection, and some just said thank you for waking up at all. Fathers prayed for their children, mothers prayed for the fever to stay away, and children, they repeated whatever their parents whispered, even if they didn't fully understand what it meant. Processions, through empty streets sometimes. The prayers didn't stay indoors. In the worst-hit towns, when hope was hanging by a thread, people took to the streets, not for parties or protests, but for processions. Lines of hooded figures moved slowly through narrow alleys and city squares, candles in hand, heads bowed. Some carried relics, others dragged wooden crosses, and from their lips came a low chant, Miserere nobis, have mercy on us. No shouting, no wailing, just steady voices, echoing off shuttered homes and empty market stalls. Sometimes priests led them, sometimes the people walked on their own, barefoot, robes brushing the mud. In a world where medicine had failed, politics were useless, and death came by air or rat or touch. Faith filled the silence. Even if God felt distant, the words still came. The rhythm of ritual, that's the thing about medieval prayer. It wasn't just belief, it was structure. Morning bells, evening prayers, church on Sundays, saints' feast days, candle offerings, rosaries counted bead by bead. When everything else spun out of control, rituals stayed the same. And there was comfort in that. You might not be able to stop the fever, but you could still light a candle. You couldn't save your neighbor, but you could still say an Ave Maria. Even if the world felt cursed, you could still do something. And sometimes, in the quiet hush before dawn, that something was all you had. Faith, fear, and flickering light. Did everyone believe the prayers worked? Not always. Some prayed out of fear, others out of habit, a few out of real, deep belief. But it wasn't really about results. It was about coping, because what do you do when science says, try herbs and leeches, and your doctor wears a beak? You pray, because it gives shape to the formless, it gives voice to the fear, and it reminds you you're not entirely alone in the dark. Final thought, that fragile morning hope, so imagine it now. A flickering candle in a cold kitchen, a child curled in a wool blanket, whispering Latin she doesn't understand, monks in distant halls, voices weaving with the wind, processions moving past your shuttered window, footsteps soft as moths. The plague is still there, but for a few quiet moments. So is hope. Chapter 5. Herbalists and backyard pharmacies, soft wind, birds chirping, the gentle clink of a wooden spoon, stirring something herbal and questionable. Before we had doctors with degrees, white coats, or microscopes, we had someone even more important in the village. The woman with dirt under her nails, a scarf on her head, and a kitchen that smelled like a forest. The herbalist, she didn't have fancy letters after her name, but she had dried plants hanging from the rafters, mysterious bottles labeled in fading ink, and a brain stuffed with recipes passed down from grandmothers who had definitely seen some things. And when the Black Death came knocking, she didn't run, she brewed. A garden of hope and weird smells. Let's start with the herbs. When the plague crept into towns and doctors started shouting about leeches and bloodletting, the herbalists quietly walked into their gardens. Garlic, rue, lavender, mugwort. These weren't just for flavor. These were weapons. Garlic was the star. Strong, pungent, believed to chase away disease, vampires, and possibly nosy neighbors. People chewed it raw, hung it in doorways, rubbed it on their skin. Rue, that bitter little plant, thought to ward off evil spirits, carried in pockets. Steeped into tea, not recommended for taste. Lavender wasn't just pretty, it was calming. It smelled like peace in a world of panic. People stuffed it into pouches and placed them under pillows, because if you were going to die, at least you'd smell nice. And mugwort. Mugwort was like that strange cousin who shows up and somehow knows how to fix a sprained ankle and summon a vision from beyond. Used in salves, smoke rituals, and medicinal beer. Each plant had a purpose, even if that purpose was mostly keep the fear at bay. Kitchen witchery 101. Back then, a good herbalist's kitchen looked like a cross between a bakery, a science lab, and a spellcasting dungeon. Cauldrons bubbling, bundles of herbs drying, jars lined up like soldiers, filled with things like soothing syrup and anti-plague paste. And the recipes, they weren't written in fancy books. They were whispered, from mother to daughter, from neighbor to neighbor, late at night, by candlelight. Boil this for 7 minutes, not 8. Never stir mugwort counterclockwise, and don't let the priest see you making this. Because yes, sometimes herbalists were also accused of witchcraft. You know, just casually. Nice. Garden, by the way, are you in league with Satan? But when the coughing started and the skin darkened, who did people run to? Not the priests, not the nobles. The lady with the lavender oil and a calming voice. Recipes from the edge of reason now. Let's talk potions. Were they effective? Sometimes. But were they comforting? Absolutely. One common plague remedy, a tonic made of vinegar, garlic, rosemary, wormwood, and lavender, known as Four Thieves vinegar. Legend says it was used by bandits who robbed plague victims without getting sick. Or maybe they were just lucky, or already dead inside. Who knows? Another hit. Plague posies, small bundles of herbs carried in hand or tucked into clothing, supposed to sweeten the air. You've heard the rhyme, ring around the rosy, a pocket full of posies. Yep, that one. Totally not a cute nursery rhyme. It's about trying not to die. People also burned herbs in their homes, not for fun but to cleanse the air, because back then, disease was believed to float around in bad smells, miasmas. So, if it stank, it was suspicious, and if it smelled nice, maybe you'd be spared. Women, wisdom, and worry. Most herbalists were women. Not because men couldn't do it, but because women ran the home. They cared for the sick, grew the gardens, knew what calmed a fever, soothed a cough, or at least masked the rot. And in times when doctors cost more than your house, these women were life preservers. Did they always get credit? No. Were they blamed when things went wrong? Often. But still, they showed up with a jar, a brew, and a quiet confidence that said, "Try this, it might help." Sometimes, that faith was the only thing people had left. Comfort over cure, let's be honest. Most herbal remedies didn't cure the Black Death, but they gave people something just as powerful. Comfort. A warm cup of something bitter but familiar. A bundle of flowers on a dying man's chest. The gentle hand of a neighbor applying a salve that wouldn't heal, but would ease the sting. In a world gone mad with fear, fire, and superstition, these little rituals mattered. They reminded people that someone still cared, that the body wasn't just a sack of disease, that even in the worst moments, there was kindness. Final thought, the quiet brew in the corner, so next time you sip tea, or light a lavender candle, or whisper your grandma's advice about garlic when you're sick, remember the backyard, a bullist, the woman with cracked hands and an herbal pouch, the one who didn't have potions that could stop the plague, but still stood by your bed. Anyway, Chapter 6, Quarantine, Medieval Style. All right folks, let's take a trip back in time. Way back to the days when quarantine wasn't just a thing, it was an absolute lifestyle choice. And honestly, not a fun one at that. No Netflix, no TikTok to pass the time, just walls, sickness, and a lot of despair. Let's talk about quarantine, medieval style. Marking houses with red crosses and Lord have mercy signs. Picture this, you're living in a medieval village, minding your own business, probably wondering if the latest plague will actually hit your neighborhood, or if you're gonna get your hands on some fresh bread from the baker. Life is tough, but you're dealing with it, right? Then, one day, someone notices a strange mark on the door of a house down the street, a red cross. Now, that's not a "please come visit" invitation, trust me. That's more like a big, neon stay away sign. And if that wasn't ominous enough, you might also spot the phrase, "Lord have mercy" scratched on the door. That's right, the folks living there were basically telling you, "We're doomed, please pray for us." This red cross became the ultimate signal that something went terribly wrong. A mark on a house wasn't just some symbol. It was a reminder that the plague had arrived, and with it, the cold hand of quarantine. The Lord have mercy sign. It was like a medieval version of Do Not Enter, but with a little extra drama, and you knew what that meant. If you were lucky enough to see that sign and run in the opposite direction, you were still alive. But if you didn't, well, there wasn't much hope left for you. Walls built around infected barrios, as if the ominous signs weren't bad enough. Medieval quarantine measures took it up a notch. They started building actual walls. That's right, entire neighborhoods would be cut off from the rest of the village or city, with barricades being thrown up at every gate. No kidding, they literally built walls around infected areas. Why? Well, to contain the spread of whatever awful disease was ripping through the population at the time. But here's the thing, it wasn't as if these walls were meant to protect the healthy folks from getting sick. Oh no, these walls were meant to trap the sick folks in. You see, once a house or an entire neighborhood had a red cross on it, that was it. You were cut off from the world. There wasn't a lot of compassion going on. No, hey, let's get you to a doctor. Nope, you were stuck, locked in with your sickness, and the rest of the world went on with its life, leaving you behind. And let's be clear, this wasn't some temporary quarantine like we might think of today, where you might be stuck at home for a couple of weeks, binge-watching your favorite show. These medieval walls were the real deal. You could be stuck in a walled-off neighborhood for months, possibly even longer. Can you imagine? Staring out from behind those walls, wondering when the next person in your neighborhood would drop dead, or when you'd be the next one to fall. It's not the kind of thing you'd want to experience, that's for sure. Guards posted at gates, families left to their fate. Okay, now this gets even more intense. What do you do when a bunch of people are locked away in a walled-off area, possibly sick, possibly spreading disease? You send in the guards, of course. You had soldiers, archers, or whatever other guards the local lords could scrape together, posted at the gates of these infected barrios. Their job, to keep anyone from escaping, and if anyone did try to leave, they weren't exactly given the benefit of the doubt. If you made a break for it, you could find yourself with an arrow in your back, or worse, a cold iron sword greeting you in the middle of your escape attempt. But here's the kicker. While the guards were doing their job, what were they actually doing for the sick families inside these walled-off barriers? Not much. There was no food delivery, no healthcare services, nothing. The guards weren't there to help the sick. They were there to make sure the sick didn't escape and spread their illness to others. So, families inside these quarantined areas were left to their own devices. And if you're thinking, well, at least they had each other for support, let me remind you that a lot of these families probably didn't make it long enough to form any kind of meaningful support system. The real tragedy, if you were infected, your family didn't have the option of coming to your aid. They were stuck out there, safe, and you were stuck in here, probably watching your world crumble around you. The emotional toll of being sealed, the emotional toll of all this quarantine business must have been astronomical. I mean, think about it. The physical isolation alone was unbearable. You're locked away from everyone you know, your neighbors, your friends, even your own family if they weren't in the same infected zone. You're surrounded by sickness, death, and despair. And at the same time, you're listening to the screams of others as they're hit by whatever deadly plague is sweeping through. On top of that, you know the guards aren't coming to help. They're not even letting you out to bury your dead properly. In fact, some places would toss the bodies into mass graves or even just leave them in the streets. It was the complete breakdown of human dignity. And the psychological toll, well, let's just say it's hard to imagine what kind of mental health you'd walk away with after surviving that. And here's where it gets kind of darkly funny in a very sad way. At the time, people didn't fully understand how diseases spread. They thought it was all about divine punishment. So, imagine being trapped in a walled-off area, maybe with your family, maybe with strangers, and knowing that the end was near. And what were you supposed to do about it? Pray, of course, but praying probably felt about as effective as shouting at a brick wall. The emotional weight of quarantine in the medieval days wasn't just about physical isolation, it was about the complete loss of control over your life. There was no escaping, no fighting back, and certainly no hope for a vaccine. That wasn't even a thing yet. The emotional despair of knowing you were just waiting for death, or hoping against hope that you'd survive another day, was as bad as the disease itself. A bit of humor to end with now. I know I've painted a pretty grim picture here, but let's just take a moment to appreciate how far we've come. Imagine if you were stuck in one of those medieval quarantines today. You'd at least have your phone to scroll through, maybe even a portable charger. You'd have Netflix, some snacks, maybe even online therapy. Back then, you were stuck in a dark, cold room with nothing but death, despair, and the faint hope that your neighbor might drop a loaf of bread over the wall. It was rough, folks. Medieval quarantine wasn't a thing you'd wish on your worst enemy. And trust me, no one was lining up for the Plague Survivor Club. So, next time you find yourself complaining about being stuck in your house, remember that the medieval folks didn't get to chill with Netflix. They were busy marking doors with red crosses, building walls around entire neighborhoods, and hoping the plague wouldn't wipe out their entire family. Let's just say, we've got it better now, right? Chapter 7. Bloodletting, leeches, and barber surgeons, soft crackling fire, gentle clinking of metal tools, a slow drip, a sigh. All right, friend, let's dim the lantern and travel back to a time when people believed the secret to good health was letting your blood drip into a bowl. Yep, welcome to the wild, slightly woozy world of bloodletting and barber surgeons. If you lived in medieval Europe and had a fever, a rash, a cough, or just looked a little pale, somebody would probably say, "You've got too much blood in you." Sounds silly, sure, but back then, it was serious business, and they had just the tools to fix you up. Let's go take a peek inside that lovely, slightly terrifying shop. The four humors and that pesky excess blood. So why was everyone so obsessed with bloodletting? Blame it on ancient medical theory. Doctors believed your body was run by four fluids, called the four humors: blood, phlegm, yellow bile, black bile. If these were balanced, you were healthy. But if one was too strong, say blood, we're in for a bad time. Solution: take some blood out, literally, through a vein, or with leeches, or cups, or knives. No, they didn't test anything. No blood types, no lab coats, just the firm belief that the blood coming out was bad, and you'd feel better once it was gone. Like fixing your car by draining all the oil and hoping for the best. Enter the barber surgeon now. If you needed this procedure done, you didn't go to a hospital. You went to someone much closer, ... Your barber. Yes, the guy who trimmed your beard and cut your hair also did surgery. Barber surgeons were like medieval multi-tools. Need a haircut, a shave, an amputation, a bit of bleeding. Same guy, same chair, same scissors. Their shops had striped poles out front, the red and white ones you still see today. But back then, red stood for blood and white for bandages. Cozy, right. Inside, you'd find tools laid out on a wooden table. Bowls for blood, razors, hooks, leeches swimming lazily in a jar, and probably a chair that had seen way too many screaming customers. Let the bleeding begin. So, what happened if you stepped inside and said, "I don't feel right"? The barber surgeon would nod sagely, roll up your sleeve or lift your tunic and say, "Ah yes, too much blood." Then, out came the blade, or sometimes a special brass needle. He'd pick a vein maybe on your arm, neck, or ankle and slice just enough to get a steady trickle. The blood would fill a bowl while you sat there trying not to faint. Sometimes, they'd even weigh how much blood they removed. Let's take a pint or two. That should balance your humors. You were lucky if they didn't keep going until your lips turned blue. Leeches tiny, wriggling doctors. If slicing wasn't your thing, or if you were just too small or weak, they'd bring out the leeches. Yes, the slimy little creatures from the river. These were placed right on your skin, often the neck, arms, or behind the ears. They latched on, sucked out blood, and fell off when full. Sometimes it took a few, sometimes a lot. The barber would stand there, watching with pride, like a gardener admiring his plants. Leeches were like medieval syringes, only much more alive, and a lot harder to clean. Fun fact, rich people liked them too. Some even had little boxes to carry their own personal leeches. Ooh, and also, weirdly bougie, cupping. The other strange option, another favorite method, was cupping. The barber would heat glass cups and place them on your back. The heat created suction, which pulled the skin up into the cup. Then he'd sometimes make tiny cuts, so the blood could rise into the glass like a spooky red lava lamp. This was considered deep cleansing. Most people just saw stars, fainted, or regretted every decision they'd made since breakfast. How did people react? You might be wondering, did it work? Well, kind of. Sometimes people felt better, probably, because they were forced to rest afterward. Other times, they fainted, got infections, or died from losing too much blood. But back then, the logic was simple. Sick, too much blood, let it out. If you die, well, you were already unwell. People accepted it. They feared it. But they also trusted it. Because what else was there? Blood everywhere, and not just yours. Barber surgeon shops were not the cleanest places. There were no gloves, no disinfectant, no band-aids. You might sit in the same chair as the last 10 patients, some of whom didn't survive. The razors, wiped on an apron and reused. The floor, sticky. The smell, don't ask. But in a world of plague and panic, these shops were weirdly comforting. Because at least someone was doing something, even if that something was making you leak like a broken wineskin. Why most people left feeling worse. Here's the sad truth. Most people bled until they were dizzy, weak, pale, sometimes beyond recovery. Doctors thought it was a success. You're quiet and calm now. Yes, because they were unconscious. And yet this went on for centuries. Even kings were bled. Even children. Even people with a cough. It didn't matter if it worked. It was tradition. Final thoughts. A shave, a slice, and a prayer. So tonight, as you drift off, imagine the flicker of a torch, the creak of a barber's chair, the whisper of a blade sliding from its pouch, the soft squish of a leech doing its medieval best. We laugh now, but for the people back then, this was real. This was medicine. Strange, messy, brave. So here's to them. And to your veins, long may they remain unbled. Chapter 8. Diet and digestive cures. Gentle simmering sound. A spoon tapping against a wooden bowl. The faint smell of herbs and bread in the airwell. If we had smell-o-vision. Alright, you're tucked in. Let's loosen that imagination a little. Because tonight, we're talking about food. No, not a medieval feast with roasted boar and overflowing wine jugs. This isn't Game of Thrones. We're heading into the kitchen of a peasant or maybe a worried town physician trying desperately to cure disease. With soup, yup. This chapter is about the medieval diet during the Black Death, and all the weird, sometimes gross, sometimes sweet little things people believed could keep the plague away. Spoiler, most of it didn't work, but they tried. And that counts for something, right? Eat this and don't die. So, picture this. You're in a little stone cottage. People are panicking. Church bells keep tolling. The smell of vinegar and fear is everywhere. What do? You go to your kitchen. You look at your cupboard. And you grab spices. That's right. Medieval folks believed spices could protect you. Cloves, cinnamon, gingerol, the stuff that makes your modern chai latte so cozy, were thought to keep sickness at bay. Why? Because they were hot and dry, and people thought the plague was cold and wet. So if you ate warm, spicy food, you were balancing your body. Spiced broth was the go-to meal. Basically, boil some water, throw in herbs, add a pinch of something expensive if you're rich or a dead onion if you're not tanned. Sip like your life depends on it, because it kinda did. Almond milk, figs, and garlic dreams. Now let's talk drinks. Almond milk was surprisingly popular, not just because people were lactose intolerant, they didn't know that yet, but because it was considered cleaner than water. Water was suspect. It sat in wells, it didn't move. People had seen rats near it, so they drank wine, beer, or almond milk instead. Figs and dates were also on the healing list, sweet, soft, and nourishing to the lungs, whatever that meant. And of course, garlic, because why not? Crush it, boil it, wear it like perfume. Garlic was the medieval MVP, smelly, but protective, allegedly. Eat a whole clove, and you probably didn't catch the plague, mainly because no one came near you. Fasting, a holy cleanse with growling stomachs. When the herbs didn't work, people turned to fasting, not for health, for spiritual cleansing. Maybe, they thought, we're being punished by God. Maybe if we stop eating, he'll stop the plague. So entire towns would fast for days, only dry bread, maybe water, maybe prayers. Some even went without food for a week. Imagine trying to fight off illness with an empty stomach and a half-burnt crust of rye. Of course, not everyone could afford to fast. Peasants who worked fields needed calories. But if the bishop said, fast or perish, you'd skip your turnip stew and hope for forgiveness. Digestive magic, bombs, powders, and poo theories. Now comes the fun part. You weren't just what you ate, you were what you digested. Physicians loved to prescribe digestive balms, which were basically crushed herbs mixed with honey, vinegar, or even ashes. You'd drink them and hope for the best. Other people took These powders made you vomit, or, yeah, you get it. The goal was to flush out the bad. If you've ever had medieval prune juice, congrats, you've been through something. Some of the more popular powders were made from burned eggshells, crushed pearls, antimony, which is toxic, and even ground up mummy powder. Yep, actual dead people. Imported from Egypt, because nothing says cure me like sprinkling sarcophagus dust into your soup. The real problem. Hunger. Here's the twist. Most people weren't trying fancy cures. They were just hungry. During plague waves, markets shut down. Farmers died. Trade stopped. Suddenly, no bread, no cheese, no nothing. People ate what they could. Bark, weeds, spoiled food, rats when they had to. And when you're starving, it doesn't matter what cures the priest talks about. You'd trade your soul for a warm bowl of porridge. It's hard to fight a disease when your body is already weak from hunger. That's what made it so terrifying. Comfort food, medieval style still. Even during the worst times, people tried to cook comfort food. Simple gruels, thick barley stews, warm cabbage soup. They didn't cure the plague, but they warmed the belly. And in the middle of the darkest days, a warm belly was sometimes the best thing you could hope for. The spoon that tried. So tonight, as you drift off, picture a small clay bowl in someone's shaking hands. Inside, a spicy oniony broth made with hope and guesswork, a mother handing it to her child, a priest sipping between sermons, a healer stirring with tired fingers. They didn't have answers, but they had garlic, they had fasting, they had hope, and they kept feeding each other even when it seemed pointless. So here's to the humble spoon, the broth, the almond milk, the failed powders, and the fig dreams. Because in a time of death, these small things kept people human. Chapter 9. Fires and fumigation. Let's get smoky. No, not in the cool barbecue way. We're talking about the medieval version of air fresheners, except they believed it could save lives. That's right, this chapter is all about how people in the Middle Ages fought off plagues and evil spirits with smoke, fire, and some very questionable smells. Because when you don't have science, you get creative. Very, very creative. Burning incense, juniper branches, and peat in homes. Imagine this. You're sitting at home in 1348. People are getting sick. Real sick. No one knows why, but everyone agrees it's got to be something in the air. The solution? Start burning stuff. And not just anything. People lit incense, bundles of dried herbs, even juniper branches. Why? Because they thought the smoke could clean the air. Not in a makes it smell better kind of way, but literally purify it. If the plague was floating around, surely a cloud of herbal smoke would chase it away, right? Juniper was a favorite. Strong smell, lots of smoke, and hey, if nothing else, it covered up the scent of, well, death. Because medieval towns didn't exactly smell like roses to begin with. Then came peat. If you don't know what peat is, think of wet dirt mixed with old plants. It burns slow and smoky and smells like a campfire that never had a happy ending. People piled it up in their homes and set it on fire, hoping the thick, dark smoke would drive out whatever was killing their neighbors. So now your house smells like a mix of holy incense, burning branches, and a bog. Lovely, huh? But hey, if it might keep you from catching the Black Death, who's complaining? Town-wide bonfires to cleanse the air. If home smoke wasn't enough, the whole town got involved. Local leaders would organize huge bonfires, like full-blown city-sized spookouts. People would gather in town squares, light giant piles of wood and herbs, and stand around while smoke filled the streets. The goal? Cleanse the air, burn out the sickness, roast the bad vibes. It kind of became a medieval block party. Minus the music, snacks, or fun. Just lots of coughing and praying. Sometimes these bonfires were set off multiple times a week. Depending on how bad the plague was, the idea was simple. The disease rides in on the air, right? So let's smoke out the whole town like it's a haunted attic. And here's the wild part, some towns even had smoke routes, where officials walked through neighborhoods carrying burning herbs in pans, waving them around like plague-fighting incense wizards. Imagine that, just walking your dog one morning and seeing a guy float by your window holding a smoking pot of sage like it's an exorcism. But instead of ghosts, he's chasing germs, with vibes, weird smells and swirling smoke, as a daily ritual. Over time, all this fire and smoke turned into a daily ritual. People just got used to living in a permanent fog. If you walked down a street, chances are you'd catch a whiff of something burning. Every house had their own favorite recipe for disease-begone smoke. Some folks threw rosemary or lavender into the fire for a nicer scent. Others got real creative. Burned some old leather. Sure, a bit of dried moss. Why not? Someone probably tossed in a shoe or two accidentally or not. We'll never know. So every day, people walked through their homes with smoky pans, waving them around like ancient air purifiers. Smoke in the bedrooms, smoke in the kitchens, smoke in the clothes. You'd come out of your house smelling like a mix between a church, a forest fire, and someone's chimney. And you couldn't escape it. Even the rich and royal did it. Kings had entire chambers filled with perfumed smoke. Doctors, if you can even call them that back then, walked around with those famous birdbeak masks stuffed with spices and flowers. Not to be stylish, it was to protect them from the bad air, or what they called miasma. That was the big theory back then. Disease didn't spread from germs, but from gross-smelling air. So naturally, the cure was better-smelling smoke. You get the logic right. Bad smells equals death. Good smells equals life. Boom. Science. The superstition that smoke drove out both demons and disease. Now here's where things get even more medieval. People didn't just believe that smoke killed disease, they thought it scared away demons. Yes, actual demons. Plague wasn't just a sickness, it was evil. Like spiritual level evil. So fire and smoke. That wasn't just medical. That was holy smoke became a kind of spiritual armor. You weren't just cleaning the air, you were driving out the darkness. Villagers believed that demons carried the plague from one house to another. And if you lit a fire and kept the smoke thick, the demons would flee. They hated the smell. They couldn't breathe in smoke. Who can? Some even said smoke confused the demons like medieval smoke bombs. You can't curse what you can't see. There were even fire rituals. People burned objects they believed were cursed, or lit candles in every window to keep evil out. Some would walk around their homes 7 times with smoking herbs because 7 was a holy number. Also, maybe they just really wanted to be extra sure. It's easy to laugh at all this now, but back then, this was serious business. Smoke wasn't just air freshener, it was a full-blown supernatural defense system. If it smelled strong, if it made your eyes water, it must be doing something right. A town in a smoke cloud, so there you have it. A medieval town during a plague was basically one big campfire without the marshmallows or good times. Homes were filled with swirling smoke. Streets smelled like burnt herbs and panic. People walked around in a haze, waving burning branches like they were casting spells. Bonfires roared in public squares, and under all that smoke was a deep hope. Maybe, just maybe, this would keep death away. Did it work? Well, not really. But that didn't stop people from trying. And weirdly, in a way, it helped. Not medically, but mentally. People needed to do something, anything, to feel like they had some control. Lighting fires, burning incense, waving smoky pots, these were little rituals that gave people a sense of safety, so next time someone lights a candle and says it's for cleansing energy, just smile. Humans have been doing that for centuries. We've always tried to fight the invisible with a little fire, a little smoke, and a whole lot of hope. Chapter 10. Baths, bleach, and hygiene myths. Soft trickling water, gentle scrubbing sounds, distant bell chimes. All right, you're cozy, wrapped up, maybe sipping something warm. It's time to slip back, way back to medieval Europe, during one of the most terrifying times in human history. And talk about baths. Yep, baths. Because, believe it or not, how you washed or didn't wash might have made all the difference during the Black Death. Or maybe it made things worse. Let's find out. Cleanliness, suspicious or sacred? Today, most of us think clean equals good. Showers every day, hand sanitizer in every pocket, soap that smells like lavender and confidence. But medieval folks, well, they had a slightly different take. In fact, some believed that bathing especially too often was actually dangerous. Let that soak in, pun intended. Why? Because people thought the pores in your skin opened up during a warm bath, and once they were open, all the nasty air and invisible poisons floating around could sneak in. Yes, in a world without germ theory, bad smells equals disease. So if you smelled something gross, you were basically doomed. And if you were wet and warm, you were a sponge. A warm bath could kill you, so during the plague, people didn't stop bathing because they were lazy. They did it because they were scared. Doctors, well, medieval ones warned, do not bathe during the pestilence. It softens the skin. The plague will enter. So people started wiping down with vinegar-soaked cloths. No joke, they'd scrub their hands, faces, even armpits with vinegar, or rosewater, if they were fancy. Some even carried cloths dipped in wine or herbs and dabbed themselves gently like a nervous raccoon with a perfume sample. No shower, no soap, just a little floral pat-pat and lots of hope. But wait, didn't people like baths? Here's the twist. People actually loved bathing. In fact, public bathhouses were super popular before the plague hit. People would soak, steam, gossip, and even eat snacks while in the tub. Bathhouses were like the medieval version of the Spomnitz coffee shop. But as soon as plague rumors started spreading, those bathhouses emptied fast, because crowded, steamy rooms filled with sweaty bodies suddenly sounded less relaxing and more like a trap. So boom, no more bathing, just panic scrubbing with vinegar rags at home. The great hygiene confusion. Now let's talk about medieval. Clean versus our version. To them, clean meant don't smell too weird, don't have visible dirt in your hair, and maybe wear a fresh tunic once a week. To us, clean means shower daily, wash your hands after ... well, everything. Wipe down your phone like it's radioactive. So imagine the chaos when a plague hits, and nobody's sure if washing will save you or kill you. Some said, scrub yourself with herbs and scented oils. Others said, stop, don't touch water, you'll open the death doors. The result, a lot of confusion, and a lot of very smelly towns. Bleach, well, sort of okay. No one had Clorox in the 1300s, but people did try disinfecting their homes. They'd burn rosemary, sage, and juniper to clean the air. They also boiled vinegar and splashed it around like magical cleaning juice. Some physicians even suggested hanging onions in your windows or rubbing garlic on your walls. Why? Because they believed those strong smells would fight off the plague vapors. It probably just made your house smell like a spicy salad. But higher for effort, the weird advice scroll medieval health guides were full of bizarre suggestions. Some fan favorites: don't get emotional. Sadness opens the pores. Avoid sex. It weakens the body. Don't sleep during the day. That's when the plague prowls. Keep your house dry. Wetness invites demons. And best of all, don't look at a sick person for too long, because apparently, eye contact spreads disease. So yes, even how you looked at people was suspect. What actually helped? Well, here's the twist. Avoiding crowded bathhouses might have actually helped a little. Those steamy tubs, perfect for spreading infection. But on the other hand, not washing at all, also not great. Some people were crawling with lice and flies, perfect vehicles for plague-carrying rats and their nasty bacteria. So ironically, both bathing and not bathing could get you killed. Yay, medieval life. The comfort of rosewater. Let's end on a gentler note. When everything felt scary and hopeless, when your neighbors were sick and the church bells wouldn't stop ringing, sometimes the little rituals helped. Dabbing yourself with lavender water, boiling mint and rosemary to cleanse your hands, lighting a little candle, saying a little prayer. It might not have cured the plague, but it made you feel like you had some control, like you were doing something, anything. And in a world full of fear and rot and silence, a warm cloth on your face smelling like roses or something to hold on to. Final thought: stay cozy, stay clean kinda. So tonight, be grateful for your warm bath, your fresh towel, your clean pajamas, because once upon a time, a warm soak wasn't comforting. It was terrifying. And now, centuries later, we can light a candle, run a bath, and know it won't bring the plague. It'll just help us sleep. Chapter 11. Amulets, charms and magical protections. Let's be real, when the world feels like it's falling apart, people grab on to whatever makes them feel safe. And back in the Middle Ages, that meant more than herbs and smoky rooms. It meant magic. Not Harry Potter kind of magic, sadly, but old school, hope and prayer, please don't let me die, kind of magic. In this chapter, we're diving deep into amulets, charms, and all the weird and wonderful ways people tried to protect themselves when doctors couldn't. And nobody really knew what germs were. It was less about science and more about vibes. Lead tokens, pilgrim badges, and phylacteries claimed to shield bearers. Let's start with some medieval bling. People didn't just walk around hoping for the best. They wore stuff, lots of stuff in their clothes, around their necks, even sewn into their hats. These weren't fashion statements. They were tiny, wearable shields against sickness. One popular item: lead tokens. Little round pieces of lead with images of saints or religious symbols stamped into them. Heavy, awkward, and honestly not cute, but hey, they were believed to protect you. If it had a saint's face on it, it had power. Then came pilgrim badges. Think of them like medieval souvenir pins. When people visited holy sites, they picked up these metal badges, usually stamped with an image of the place or the saint who lived there. The idea was, I've been to a holy spot, so now I'm extra blessed. And that blessing, people believed, could keep the plague away. Saint Christopher was a top pick. He protected travelers, which apparently included travelers of the airborne disease variety. And let's not forget phylacteries. Big word, simple idea. These were tiny boxes or pouches filled with holy verses or relics. Some folks tied them around their arms or necks, others hid them in their clothes. Imagine walking around with a Bible verse in your sock and thinking, yep, this'll stop the Black Death. It might sound silly now, but back then, these items were lifelines. Wearing a charm was like walking around with a security blanket, only blessed by a priest. Homemade charms, drawn crosses, written prayers tucked in pockets, of course. Not everyone could afford shiny badges or holy souvenirs. So what did the average person do? DIY charms. Of course, people drew crosses on their doors, their beds, their windows, anywhere they thought evil might sneak in. And not with fancy paint. We're talking charcoal, chalk, or even just scratching it into the wood with a knife. Simple stuff, but meaningful. Others wrote down prayers or Bible verses and folded them up real small. These would go into pockets, purses, boots, wherever. you could hide a little hope. Some even stitched them inside their clothes, like plague-era pockets of positivity. One popular written charm was the abracadabra triangle. You wrote the word over and over, each time dropping a letter, until the bottom line was just the belief that as the word disappeared, so would the sickness. Honestly, that's kind of clever. And hey, maybe it gave people a sense of control. Like, sure, I can't fight off the plague, but at least I've got this secret pocket prayer that's looking out for me. The blacksmith who forged protective iron nails. Now this part, straight up legend. Every town had at least one blacksmith, a guy who made horseshoes, swords, and whatever else needed hammering. But in plague times, blacksmiths sometimes took on a different role, makers of magical weapons. One famous tale tells of a blacksmith who forged iron nails, not for construction, but for protection. These weren't just any nails, they were made during certain phases of the moon, often while chanting prayers. The idea was that iron, especially hand-forged, could scare away demons or spirits bringing disease. Families would place these nails at doorways, windows, or even wear tiny versions on a necklace. Forget garlic. For vampires, this was the real medieval anti-evil tech. Iron had this rep for being strong, pure, and kind of mystical. It was like, if anything evil wants to get in here, it's gonna have to fight this chunk of iron first. Which again, sounds weird now, but made perfect sense in a world with no idea about bacteria. And you gotta love the image. Some nervous villager hammering magical nails into his front door, muttering prayers, probably while smoke from last night's bonfire still lingers in the air. That's dedication. Why magic felt as vital as medicine. So, why all this magic? Why not just stick to doctors? Well, here's the thing. Medicine back then wasn't exactly inspiring. You might get bled with leeches, dosed with something gross, or told to carry flowers in your nose, and the success rate, not great. People needed hope, and magic gave them that. It wasn't about spells and wands, it was about faith, tradition, and the feeling that something was protecting you. When nothing else made sense, a charm in your pocket felt better than nothing, and honestly, a lot of these magical practices were healing, just not in the medical sense. They were emotionally comforting. They gave people rituals, structure, and a bit of control in a time that felt totally out of control. Even today, we keep lucky coins, wear sentimental jewelry, or carry a note from someone we love. It's the same energy. Medieval folks just leaned into it a little harder. Plus, it brought communities together. Someone made you a charm that meant they cared. A neighbor giving you a blessed token. That was love in metal form. Magic wasn't just protection, it was connection. Charms, chaos, and the human spirit in the end. Amulets and charms were never just trinkets. They were people's way of holding on mentally, spiritually, emotionally, when everything around them felt like it was falling apart. Whether it was a heavy lead token, a scribbled prayer stuffed in a boot, or a forged iron nail hammered into the front door, it all meant that same thing. Please, let me survive this. And sometimes, that belief was powerful enough to carry people through the worst times. Maybe not in body, but definitely in spirit. So yeah, medieval people were walking around with magic in their pockets. And honestly, who can blame them? Chapter 12. Psyche and Survival. Mind over melody. Soft lute music. Echo of distant laughter. Then quiet again. Alright, you're tucked in. Lights are low. Let's ease back into the foggy streets of the medieval world. Tonight, we're not talking about bloodletting, rat bites, or garlic potions. Nope, we're talking about something even more powerful, the human mind. Because during the Black Death, when everything felt like it was crumbling, health, family, faith, sometimes, your brain was your last line of defense. Let's explore how people survived, not just physically, but mentally. Laughter in the dark. Now imagine this. You're stuck in a tiny village. The plague has taken half the town. The bells don't stop ringing. The priest's hair is turning white, and yet, in the courtyard, someone's making jokes. Not the stand-up comedy kind. More like whelp. If the rats don't eat me, the soup will. Or, guess I'm not dying today, Agnes. Still got chores. Yeah, dark humor. Real gallows giggles. People laughed, not because things were funny, but because they were scared. Laughter gave them a little oxygen, a tiny moment of relief in the storm. And honestly, it helped. Humor, even the grim kind, became a shield. A way to stay human when everything around you screamed otherwise. Storytelling. In cellars, let's go underground for a moment. Literally, as the plague swept in, people often hid in cellars, dark, damp, musty rooms where they waited for the sickness to pass, like a bad storm. And what did they do down there? They told stories. Old legends, new tales, saints, heroes, lovers, monsters. Mothers whispered bedtime rhymes. Grandfathers spun long fables. Kids made up silly games using pebbles and candlelight. These weren't just time fillers, they were survival tools. When the world outside made no sense, stories gave structure. When hope felt too heavy, stories gave wings. And when death knocked, stories reminded them they were still alive. Dreams, visions, and strange hope. Now here's where things get mystical. During the plague, people started reporting weird dreams. Prophets saw angels. Villagers dreamed of rivers washing sickness away. Some saw fire. Some saw the Virgin Mary waving a white cloth. Were they just dreams, or the brain's way of coping? Some folks believed dreams were messages from God, from spirits, from lost loved ones. Others took comfort in the idea that if you dreamed of a good harvest, or a healed village, or even just a warm loaf of bread, maybe it was a sign. Even if it wasn't real, the dream itself gave people a reason to get up the next day. And sometimes, that was enough. The power of the group hug, metaphorically okay. So medieval people didn't exactly do group hugs. They weren't big on touching during a pandemic, but community mattered. In villages that worked together, shared food, helped bury the dead, checked on the sick, survival rates were often higher. People left bread on doorsteps, hung herbs in each other's windows, whispered prayers through closed shutters. In some towns, monks rang bells every morning just so people knew, hey, we're still here, you're not alone. That little bit of connection, it kept people going, because isolation wasn't just sad, it was dangerous. Loneliness made the mind crumble faster than fever. And when community collapsed, when people turned on each other, the death toll usually wasn't far behind. The legends of the lucky few. Now let's talk about the stories that made people believe recovery was possible. You'd hear things like, old Marta drank rosemary tea, said her prayers, and walked right out of it. The stable boy only ate garlic and honey, still alive. He touched the relic and woke up fine. Whether these were true or not didn't matter. These little miracle stories gave people hope, and hope is powerful stuff. Hope made people try herbal salves. Hope made them light candles. Hope made them smile at their children, even when the coughing got worse. Some of those stories were probably exaggerated. Some were total myths, but all of them were fuel. And in a time with no medicine, no vaccine, no TikTok doctor giving tips, hope was the only prescription. So what can we learn? Honestly, a lot. People laughed, told stories, dreamed, helped each other, clung to faith, and believed in recovery even when the world was falling apart. And that wasn't weakness, that was strength. It wasn't always about fancy remedies or holy relics. It was about sitting in a dark room, telling a funny story, and saying, we're still here, let's keep going. Final thought before sleep. So tonight, as you close your eyes, maybe smile, just a little. Because somewhere, in a cold stone cellar, centuries ago, someone told a story under candlelight. They laughed, they hoped, and somehow, they survived. You've made it through another chapter. Chapter 13, Clerical Comfort and Last Rites, all right. So you've survived smoky rooms, magical charms, and Red Cross quarantine zones. But now it's time to talk about what happened when things got serious, like final serious. In this chapter, we're stepping into the candlelit world of priests, prayers, and that final medieval send-off, the last rites. Yep, things are about to get holy, and maybe a little spooky. Priests administering extreme unction in candlelit rooms. Picture it, a small, cold room lit by one flickering candle. There's coughing in the corner, the air smells like smoke, and herbs, and someone's lying in bed, pale as parchment. Enter the priest. He's not wearing armor, but he might as well be. These guys were spiritual first responders, called in when someone was clearly not going to make it. The ritual was called extreme unction, or the last rites. Basically, it was a spiritual Hail Mary pass. The priest would bring holy oil, sprinkle a little holy water, and try to squeeze in a few prayers before time ran out. Think of it as a medieval clean up your soul before you go service. It was emotional. People were crying, praying, whispering, final goodbyes. But also, let's be honest, it was kind of terrifying. because when the priest showed up with the oil, you knew what that meant. This wasn't your average get-well-soon visit. This was your exit interview with God. And sometimes, these rites happened fast, like speed round. Priests had to visit house after house, trying to bless as many dying people as possible. They were like plague paramedic sext. Instead of CPR, they offered eternal salvation. The tension of confession under duress. Now let's talk about confession. Imagine you're lying there, sweating, maybe delirious, and suddenly a priest leans in and says, anything you want to confess. Before you know the end, no pressure. Right, but this was serious stuff. People believed that if you didn't confess your sins before you died, your soul might end up in a very bad place, like eternal fire and screaming bad. So even if you were gasping for breath, you had to dig deep and remember every sin you ever committed. And some confessions, probably wild, like I stole bread from the market. I secretly hate my brother. I faked being sick too. Skip mass. It's honestly impressive how fast people could confess under pressure. Talk about a spiritual speedrun. But it wasn't just fear. Some people wanted to confess. It gave them peace, a clean slate, a final chance to make things right, at least in their soul. And when you're facing death, that peace of mind, it's everything. Still, it's hard not to imagine the priest sweating a bit too. Like, okay, let's move this along. I've got 12 more houses to hit before sunset. Burial rites, mass graves versus individual funerals. Now comes the part that gets a bit grim. What happened after? In the early days of the plague, people still got proper funerals. Bells rang, processions walked, family members cried, someone read a psalm or two, and the person got buried with care. But when things got bad, there were just too many bodies. That's when mass graves became the new normal. Huge pits were dug outside town walls. Bodies were stacked in layers, sometimes with a bit of quicklime thrown in to help with the smell. It wasn't disrespect, it was survival. There just weren't enough people left to dig individual graves. Imagine the shift from a world where every person had their moment, to a world where death came too fast for rituals to keep up. Some families still tried. If they could, they buried their loved ones quietly, maybe with a wooden cross or a whispered prayer. But most of the time, it was out of their hands. Local workers or whatever ragtag team was still alive, hauled bodies away, quick, quiet, and rough. And let's be honest, the fear was real. Touching a dead body could mean catching the plague. So even burials got rushed. Some priests stopped attending. Even the amen was sometimes skipped. The solace and terror of final prayers. Here's the thing. In all this chaos, final prayers mattered. They weren't just part of the ceremony. They were emotional anchors, whether you were the one dying or the one left behind. Hearing those last words, "May the Lord bless you and keep you," meant something. A tiny spark of peace in the middle of fear. Sometimes the person couldn't speak, so the priest would say the prayer for them. Other times, family members gathered and repeated the words through tears. These were the moments that reminded people they were still human, even when the world around them felt like a horror movie. But also, it was terrifying. Final prayers meant the end was here. Once those words were spoken, there was no more pretending. You weren't going to recover. You were heading off to the next life, whatever that looked like, under pressure to get it right. Huge. People believed that a good death meant a better afterlife. So the timing of the prayer, the posture of the body, even the direction the person faced it, all mattered. Some folks were even buried with little prayer scrolls or wooden crosses, just to be safe. You know, afterlife insurance, faith in the face of fear in the end. All these rituals, last rites, confessions, final prayers were about comfort. When nothing else made sense, when the plague was knocking at every door, people turned to faith. It didn't cure the disease, but it gave people hope. It gave them structure, purpose, and a little sense of control when everything else felt like chaos. The priests, bless them, did what they could. They walked into homes filled with death and still whispered hope. Even if they were scared, and let's be real, they definitely were. They showed up. Some people died surrounded by family and prayer. Others passed quietly in the dark, with only the echo of their faith for company. But all of them, in some way, held on to the belief that death wasn't the end. In a time of fear, faith lit the final candle. Chapter 14. Children amid the chaos, soft wind, distant church bells. The sound of a child's laughter fades into quiet. Let's settle in. Tonight, we're taking a softer, smaller step into the past. Not knights, not kings, just kids. Tiny hands, muddy feet, wide eyes trying to survive. The biggest nightmare their little world had ever seen. This is the story of the children of the Black Death, the orphans of the plague. It started slowly. First, someone sneezed. Then someone coughed. And before a child even knew what plague meant, their home was silent. Mom, gone. Dad, carried away in a cart. A brother, maybe a baby sister, just missing. Suddenly, you're 7 years old and all alone. These weren't just sad stories, they were everywhere. Some children ended up wandering the streets barefoot, clutching a crust of bread like treasure. Others stayed put, frozen in homes that no longer felt like homes. But kids are strange little warriors. Even in the middle of that sadness, they found ways to survive. Scavenging for life with no adults around. Many orphaned kids had to become their own caretakers. They picked herbs from gardens because they heard garlic helped. They stole bread from markets because hunger didn't care about rules. They knocked on doors, hoping someone kind would answer. Sometimes, kind souls took them in. Other times, doors stayed closed. Still, the kids kept going. They made up games with sticks. They told stories under porches. They whispered to the moon. One little boy in a village near Florence supposedly fed himself for weeks by catching frogs and roasting them on flat stones. Weird, yeah, but hey, survival isn't always neat. The monastery schools that changed before the plague. Some lucky children got to go to monastery schools, quiet places filled with chanting monks and scratchy ink. But when the sickness hit, those peaceful places changed. Some schools shut their doors, others turned into plague help stations. Instead of Latin lessons, kids helped monks clean, cook, and care for the sick. They learned how to make herbal poultices. They watched monks weep quietly behind cloister walls. Imagine being 9 years old and trying to comfort a coughing stranger, because no one else could. Heavy stuff. But that was the world now. Families split and sometimes found again. Here's a part of plague life no one talks about much. The separation. Some kids were taken away from sick families to avoid infection. Others ran, some were left behind by carts too full to carry them. But not all was lost. There are quiet records hidden in dusty letters of reunions. A girl who thought her mother had died found her again months later in another village. Two brothers, taken to different monasteries, reconnected through a passing friar. Even a child raised by strangers who returned home to find an uncle still alive and waiting. Tiny moments of light in a very dark time. Little hands, little prayers before sleep if they were lucky enough to have a bedchildren whispered prayers. They weren't fancy. They didn't quote saints. They just asked, "Please keep my mama safe. Don't let me get sick. Make the rats go away." Some kids clung to carved crosses. Some hugged cloth dolls. Some just looked at the stars and whispered things they barely understood. But somehow, those little prayers hung in the air like soft candles, unseen, but powerful, because in the middle of panic, prayer gave kids something to hold. A rope, a whisper, a little bit of hope. Joy in the gaps. And here's the most surprising part. Even with all the sorrow, kids found joy. They still chased chickens through alleyways. They still made mud pies. They still giggled when someone farted during church service, because that's what kids do. Even when the world breaks, they find reasons to laugh. A girl once tied rosemary around a cat's tail and called it her plague detector. A group of boys in Paris built tiny carts and raced them down plague-empty streets. Were they scared? Of course. But laughter was their shield. What they left behind, we don't have many names of these children. No diaries, no birthday candles. But we see their traces in the legends, the lullabies, and the prayers passed down. They weren't warriors or saints. They were just small, brave humans in a time too big for them, and many of them made it. Not because they had medicine, but because they had spirit. Final thought before sleep. So tonight, close your eyes, and picture this. A quiet village road. A child crouched under a porch, a piece of bread in hand. A cat curled beside her, and above, stars twinkling in the same sky we sleep under now. Chapter 15. The rich and the rue, soft horse hooves, rustling trees, church bells in the far distance. All right, get comfy. Tonight, we're leaving behind the dirty alleyways and crowded plague-struck towns. We're taking a quiet ride into the countryside, where the air smells like herbs and old money, This chapter is all about the rich. But don't worry, there's no mansion envy here. Because during the Black Death, even the fanciest slippers couldn't outrun the shadow sneaking through the streets. When in doubt run, so picture this. It's 1348. The plague is creeping through town like a ghost in a hurry. People are coughing. Priests look nervous. Markets smelled worse than usual. Now, imagine you're rich. You've got a nice house, maybe even a servant or two. You eat meat every week. And when whispers of death hit the air, you don't wait. You pack the silverware. You tell your cook to wrap up the goose. You load the kids, the cat, and the family priest into a carriage and you run for the hills. Literally, wealthy folks often fled to the countryside, hoping fresh air and distance would keep the plague away. Spoiler, it didn't always work. Escape in style, running from a pandemic is scary, but doing it in velvet robes while sipping spiced wine, that's kinda stylish. Noble families didn't just escape quietly. They rolled out like medieval rock stars. Think, horses draped in embroidered cloth, servants carrying crates of preserved fruit and wine, one guy holding the family birdcage. Yes, seriously, some even brought their own doctors. Fancy ones with gold-trimmed masks and little leather bags full of curatives, which usually meant vinegar or perfume or dried frogs. Yeah, medicine was still weird. Homemade remedies for fancy people. The rich had their own plague-fighting tricks. Stuff like clove-studded oranges to sniff during bad air, rosewater baths, because plague obviously hated luxury, imported spices boiled into wine and sipped like medicine, physicians in colorful robes who offered diagnoses that mostly blamed the stars or moist air. Some nobles even commissioned custom incense to burn in their hallways, because when death comes knocking, at least let the house smell like cinnamon. One diary even mentions a countess who slept with a ruby on her chest to repel death. Bold of her, didn't work. Distance wasn't always enough. Now, here's where it gets real. Yes, wealth gave you a head start, a bigger wagon, a safer spot, a better meal, but it didn't buy immunity. Many nobles still died, quietly, in country estates, far from town but not far from fate. One famous case, the Medici family in Italy, rich beyond belief, had doctors, priests, even astrologers, still lost family members, still buried them fast, still whispered prayers like everyone else. The Black Death didn't care about your bank account. It knocked on every door, gold or no gold. Servants, the hidden cost. Now let's pause a second, because behind every fleeing noble family was a team of servants, maids, cooks, guards, gardeners, stable boys. They didn't get choices, they just followed orders. And if the plague came with them, they were usually the first to get sick, and the last to get care. One letter tells of a manor that locked its infected staff in the cellar, with extra wine, as a mercy. They didn't come out. So while the rich tried to escape, they often brought tragedy with them, wrapped in silk, riding beside the luggage. The lonely estates, even when rich families made it to safety, it didn't feel like a party. No guests, no banquets, no music, just silence. They couldn't invite neighbors, they couldn't visit town. They lived behind locked gates, breathing through herbs, stuffed in cloth. And when someone coughed, panic. Suddenly, the giant castle felt small, and no amount of rose oil could hide the truth. They were just as scared as the peasants they'd left behind. Regret, reflection, and rue. Let's talk about rue, not just the herb. Though yes, they did carry it in pouches. We're talking about the kind of rue that shows up in quiet thoughts. Many nobles started to question things during the plague. Why did the rich survive while the poor didn't? Why did priests die, even after prayers? What was all the gold worth if it couldn't buy peace? Some gave away land, some donated to churches, some just broke down, because the plague didn't just touch bodies, it haunted minds. And sometimes, the silence of the countryside was louder than the streets. Rich or poor, everyone prayed the same. Here's a thought to end on. Whether you lived in a wooden hut or a painted palace at night, everyone whispered the same things. Please keep me safe. Please protect my family. Please, let this end. Fear has a way of making us all equal. So does hope. And now, rest as you drift off tonight. Picture a soft green hill, a carriage parked beneath a tree, silk curtains pulled shut. Inside, a family listens to the wind. They've run far, but the fear still lingers. Outside, a servant places rosemary at the gate. He doesn't know if it helps, but it's something. Sometimes. That's all we can do. So take a breath. You're safe now. Chapter 16. Pilgrimages and penances so far. We've talked about smoke, charms, quarantine, and even last rites. But now we get to one of the most intense responses to the plague, and no, it didn't involve leeches or incense. It involved feet and whips and lots of public pain. Yep. Welcome to the world of pilgrimages and penance, where people didn't just pray for healing. They walked, bled, and begged their way toward it. Because when you're scared out of your mind and the local doctor is useless, sometimes all you can do is pack your bag, hit the road, and hope God's still listening. Pilgrims journeying to sacred shrines, seeking cure first. Let's talk about pilgrimages. Think of them as the medieval version of a health retreat, minus the spa and smoothies. People believed certain places, usually where saints had lived, died, or worked miracles, were extra holy. So when plague hit, thousands of terrified folks tied up their sandals and started walking. Some went miles, others went across countries, all with the same desperate hope. If I can just reach that shrine, maybe I won't die. Some popular spots: the shrine of St. Thomas Becket in Canterbury, or Santiago de Compostela in Spain. But honestly, any town with a halfway famous saint or miracle rumor became a hotspot. These trips weren't easy. Roads were dangerous. Food was scarce. And oh yeah, you're doing all this while a deadly disease is going around. It's like trying to dodge arrows while hiking barefoot through a thunderstorm. But they did it. Some limped, some crawled. Many didn't make it. But for the ones who did, reaching the shrine meant more than just survival, it meant hope. Even if they weren't cured, they felt heard. That mattered. And let's not forget, some of these folks were carrying plague sores. So let's just say these pilgrim routes weren't exactly COVID safe. Flagellant processions, scourging themselves in the streets. Now buckle up. Because if pilgrimages sound intense, wait till you meet the flagellants. These were groups of people who believed the plague was punishment from God for humanity's sins. Their solution: punish themselves before God could. Yep, they marched into towns, singing hymns and chanting prayers, then took off their shirts and started whipping themselves with real whips until their backs were covered in blood. It was dramatic, it was painful, and it definitely got attention. Imagine sitting at your window, already stressed about the plague, and seeing a parade of barefoot, bleeding people walk by, smacking themselves while yelling Latin prayers. That's not something you forget easily. These flagellant processions swept across Europe, especially during the worst outbreaks. People joined in by the hundreds. Some thought it might earn them forgiveness. Others just didn't want to be left out because, hey, what if this was the thing that actually worked? And to be fair, these guys were really committed. They had uniforms, schedules, chants, even choreographed routines, like the deadliest flash mob in history. But not everyone was impressed. Some towns banned them. Some church leaders were like, hey, maybe stop scaring people and bleeding all over the street. But the flagellants weren't listening. They were on a divine mission. How collective penance both worried and united communities. Here's where it gets complicated. These public acts of suffering, whether walking for days or whipping your own back, weren't just personal. They were community events. People watched. People joined. Some cried. Some cheered. Others locked their doors. In a weird way, all this pain actually brought communities together. When everyone's scared and helpless, seeing someone suffer for the group feels powerful. Like, hey, maybe if Bob over there whips himself hard enough, God will spare the rest of us. But it also caused tension. Some towns saw it as a blessing. Others saw it as dangerous. What if these acts just made things worse? What if they angered God even more? And not to mention, flagellant groups sometimes got aggressive. They'd roll into town like, we're here to save your souls. And if the local priest disagreed, things could get heated fast. So yeah, this wasn't always peaceful penance. It could get wild. Still, there was a strange kind of unity in shared suffering. People needed something, anything to believe in. And watching someone walk barefoot across the country or whip their back raw felt, oddly, like action. The line between faith and fanaticism. Now let's talk about the elephant in the room. Where's the line between real faith and total chaos? Because let's face it, some of this stuff got extreme. And not everyone whipping themselves in the street was doing it out of deep spiritual belief. Some were caught up in the crowd, others were desperate. And a few, well, they just liked the drama. Church officials eventually stepped in. The Pope declared that many of these flagellant movements were not officially supported, and some were, even seen as a threat to the Church's authority. Why? Because these groups weren't just praying, they were preaching, leading, and acting like they had direct hotline access to God. That didn't sit well with the guys in Rome. So our pilgrimages stuck around as a more official form of penance. The wild self-whipping processions slowly faded or were shut down entirely. Still, this whole chapter of history shows just how far people will go when they're scared and seeking answers. When medicine doesn't help, when prayers don't seem enough, when nothing makes sense, people get creative, and sometimes a little bit extreme. Dusty roads, open wounds, and the power of belief at the end of the day. Pilgrimages and penance weren't really about curing disease, they were about coping. Every dusty road, every sore foot, every self-inflicted whip, mark it all came from the same place: desperation. People needed to believe that there was still hope, still meaning, still some path, however painful, that could lead to mercy. And honestly, that kind of faith is powerful. Was it messy? Absolutely. Was it extreme? For sure. But behind the sweat and blood was a simple, human plea. Please, let this end. And sometimes, that shared cry shouted from the roads, the shrines, or the scarred backs of strangers, was enough to keep people going one more day. Chapter 17. Economic collapse and community bonds. Soft wind through broken shutters, a faint, clinking bell, quiet voices bartering in the distance. All right, cozy up. Tonight, we're not heading into the plague doctor's mask or mixing herbs in a smoky kitchen. Tonight, we're stepping into something a bit quieter but just as heavy. What happens when money stops working? When markets close, coin purses stay shut, and the baker isn't baking anymore. This is a chapter about survival, sure, but it's also about neighbors, about the strange little sparks of humanity that showed up right in the middle of the darkness. Let's talk about what happens to an economy and to the people when everything collapses. Fields gone quiet. Imagine you're a farmer. You've got sheep, some barley, maybe a cranky rooster who thinks 4 a.m. is a great time to scream. Then one day, you hear coughing. Then your neighbor vanishes. Then the priest stops showing up for prayers. You still need to milk the goats, but who are you milking them for? Many fields were simply abandoned. Too many workers died, or were too scared to return. So crops sat unharvested, fruit rotted, grain stores got dusty. Even animals wandered aimlessly. In some places, flocks of sheep outnumbered people. One monk even wrote, "The sheep ran through the empty streets, buying into silence." A weird image, right, but also kind of haunting. The markets fell first. Markets were once the heartbeat of every medieval town. They had noise, smells, merchants yelling about cabbages. But once the plague hit, silence, stalls were left empty, shoppers stopped showing up. And if someone did try to sell something, prices were all over the place. One day, bread was cheap. Next day, worth its weight in silver. People didn't know what anything was worth anymore. Not goats, not coins, not even their own work. Money lost meaning. What mattered more? Firewood, a jar of honey, news from the next village over, neighbors in the time of need. Now here's where things get surprisingly warm. Even though everything was falling apart, some people didn't. Some came together. There are stories of neighbors sharing firewood during a harsh winter, of families pooling grain for soup, of teenagers standing guard outside a house where a baby was sick so no one disturbed them. One record from Italy mentions a woman who baked bread every morning and left it on the church steps. No names, no money, just kindness. It wasn't always like this. Fear made people do awful things but in the quiet spaces, when the shouting stopped, some folks chose to help instead of hide. The shadow economy. Let's talk smuggling. Because when laws disappear, guess who shows up? Yep, the local entrepreneurs. With markets shut and goods scarce, a secret system began to form. People traded things in whispers. A wheel of cheese for some garlic, a few eggs for dried herbs, a gold ring for someone to sneak medicine across town. Some folks made a living this way, dangerous, yes, but necessary. And some traded not with goods, but with trust. Take this loaf now, bring me some wood next week. That quiet trust, built under pressure, kept entire villages alive. Currency, redefined gold, silver, coins stamped with royal faces. Useless sometimes. What had real value? a working shovel, a pot of salt, a clean bucket of water. People began bartering with what they could do, not just what they owned. If you could sew great, fix a wheat perfect, sharpen a blade, someone needed you. This new system wasn't fair, but it was real. And for a little while, it worked. It reminded folks, you don't survive with money. You survive with usefulness. And maybe a good turnip stew. Rebuilding with bonded hands. And when the worst passed, because yes, eventually it did, people didn't jump straight back to coins and castles. They rebuilt with relationships. Friends who shared food became family. Villagers who defended each other started councils. Strangers who offered help became legends in town stories. Even long after the plague faded, some of these community bonds stuck around. They shaped how towns were run, how charity worked, even how people saw wealth itself. Not as something you stash in a chest, but something you share. When the sky turns dark, when the world wobbled, we held on. So let's slow things down for a second. Imagine you're lying on straw in a tiny cottage. It's winter. You haven't seen a merchant in weeks, but there's a candle glowing. A neighbor left soup by your door. And outside, you hear someone humming a hymn. That's not an economy. That's hope. When money broke down, people didn't. At least not all of them. And maybe that's the real secret to survival. Not the leeches, not the vinegar, but the hands that reached out, even in fear. And tonight, as you drift off tonight, think of a quiet village. Fires glowing softly, bread baking in secret, a knock at the door, and someone's left apples on the stoop. No note, no name, just a quiet act of solidarity. Even in the shadow of the plague, humans remembered how to be human. Chapter 18. Art, literature, and the dance of death. So what do you do when everyone around you is dying? The doctors are clueless, and the air smells like smoke and fear. You make art, of course. That might sound strange, but during the worst years of the plague, people didn't just curl up and wait to die. They painted, wrote, carved, sang, and even performed in the streets. Why? Because when the world feels like it's ending, sometimes the only way to deal with it is to turn it into a story. Welcome to the wild world of plague-era art, literature, and everyone's favorite grim party trick, the dance of death, the danse macabre. Paintings and street performances. Let's start with something you may have seen in a museum, on a creepy old church wall, or maybe on a heavy metal album cover. The danse macabre sounds fancy, but it literally means dance of death. And yes, it's exactly what it sounds like. These were murals, paintings, and woodcuts, showing skeletons dancing with the living. But not just random people, everyone was there. Kings, queens, farmers, bishops, beggars, even babies. Death didn't care about your social status. He grabbed your hand and pulled you onto the dance floor just the same. And it wasn't just paintings. People performed this stuff in the streets. Actors dressed up like death, probably with some very questionable makeup, and went around dragging fake corpses behind them. They'd stop in town squares, recite grim little rhymes, and do a creepy jig that reminded everyone, you're gonna die too. Might as well enjoy the tune. Morbid, definitely, but also kind of brilliant. It turned this huge, terrifying thing into something you could look at, laugh at, even dance with. It was art as therapy, a way to say, yeah, we're all doomed, but at least we can groove on the way out. Chronicles and poems written in plague years, but not everyone was dancing. Some people picked up a pen instead of a paintbrush, and what they wrote down, honestly, it's some of the most powerful stuff you'll ever read. Medieval writers documented the plague in letters, journals, poems, and full-blown chronicles. They didn't hold back. They wrote about the smell of bodies, the fear in the streets, the silence after a family was wiped out. These weren't just writers, they were witnesses. One of the most famous plague books, Boccaccio's Decameron, it's about a group of rich young people hiding from the Black Death in a countryside villa. To pass the time, they tell each other stories, some romantic, some funny, some completely wild. It's like The Bachelor meets Canterbury Tales, with a plague happening in the background. The idea was clear. Life still had stories worth telling, even while death knocked at the door. Other writers got even more serious. Some chroniclers just listed names of the dead. Others described how entire towns vanished. A few sprinkled in, some drama-like, blaming the stars, or claiming the rivers ran red. Hey, medieval journalism had flair. But again, it wasn't just reporting. It was a way to process what was happening. Writing turned chaos into meaning. It gave people a reason to keep thinking, keep feeling, and keep being human even when everything felt inhuman. How art helped people make sense of mass loss. Now here's the big thing. Why did people make all this art and literature during one of the darkest times in history? Because they needed to make sense of it all. Imagine losing your family, your friends, maybe your whole town, then being told, well, life goes on. That's not something the brain just bounces back from. People needed more than facts. They needed stories to carry the weight. A skeleton dragging a king into a dance. That wasn't just a fun painting. It was a way to say, even the rich can't escape this. It leveled the playing field, gave people a weird sense of justice. Poems helped people cry, or laugh, or just feel something other than fear. And even the darkest art had a strange kind of beauty. It said, yes, death is here, but so are we, and we're still telling the story. That's the magic of it all. In a time of silence and sickness, art spoke. The gentle humor hiding in macabre imagery now. Here's where it gets kind of funny. Literally. Yes, a lot of plague art was creepy. Skeletons, coffins, grim prayers, but there was also this dry, sneaky humor woven through it all. Take the Dance of Death. Sure, it showed death pulling people into the grave. But the jokes were there, too. Like death showing up at a royal feast and being like, nice crown, you won't need it. Or a greedy merchant getting dragged away mid-deal, holding a sack of gold like, wait, I just made a sale. This wasn't humor for laughs. It was more like a wink, a reminder that even in the worst times, people still needed a bit of levity, a smirk in the face of doom. Even writers got cheeky. Some plague poems read like dark comedy sketches. One guy wrote a poem that ended with, well, everyone's dead. Guess I'll go pray, or drink. Relatable. It's amazing, really. In the middle of all the death and fear, people still found a way to poke fun at it. Not because it was funny, but because humor was one of the last defenses they had. A final act of rebellion. Laughing with death, not at it, so yeah. Art during the plague wasn't just about beauty or skill. It was about survival. The paintings, the poems, the performances were how people talked back to death, how they made sense of grief, how they held on to something human in a world that felt broken. And maybe that's why so much of that art still hits today. Because even now, when things get scary or weird or too big to handle, we still tell stories. We still draw, write, sing, dance, because that's what humans do. We create, even when we're falling apart. And somewhere out there, maybe death is still dancing. But you know what? So are we. Chapter 19. Survivors' stories and village legends. Soft crickets. A night breeze through an open window. Distant church bell echoing. All right, lay your head back. Let's time travel one more time tonight. We've wandered through the worst of Atashes. Silence, sorrow. But now, we pause with the people who remained. Because after the plague had passed, after the carts rolled away and the last candles burned low, some were still standing. Few, yes, but enough to whisper stories into the next century. Tonight, we're gathering around the embers to hear the legends that grew not from books, but from voices and quiet hearts. 1 in 10 imagine a small village. Let's say it had 100 people. After the plague, maybe 10 survived, or 5, sometimes just 1. Now picture that one. They're sitting on a worn bench, a dog sleeping at their feet, and a wide-eyed child asking, what happened before I was born? And so begins the tale. Most survivors didn't write, they remembered, and they spoke. They told of neighbors who coughed once and never again, of bread left on empty windowsill, of the silence when even the birds stopped singing. Some details blurred over time. Some grew ... interesting, like the woman who held off death with garlic and shouting. Or the blacksmith who, legend says, sneezed so loud the plague ran away. Not all true, but stories have their own kind of truth. Recipes in the margins. Here's a little-known secret. Monks didn't just copy Bibles, they scribbled everything, hidden between verses and psalms. You might find a plague tonic recipe. Mix rue, sage, vinegar, and a whisper of ash. Boil, thrice, say the Lord's Prayer 7 times. Sounds oddly specific. Possibly gross, but who's judging? Villagers passed these recipes from kitchen to kitchen, not because they worked, but because they gave hope. And hope, like garlic, was better than nothing. Some healers added their own flair. One added honey, another swore by mustard seed and prayer beads. We can't say they cured anyone, but sometimes belief is its own bomb. Pilgrims and their visions, survivors often went walking, not to escape but to give thanks. They became pilgrims, traveling to shrines, lighting candles, and sharing stories with strangers on dusty roads. Some said they saw saints in dreams. Others claimed voices led them to hidden herbs or safe places. One tale speaks of a barefoot child who wandered into a ruined town and found every church candle still lit. Did it happen? Who knows? But it comforted those who heard it. Pilgrims brought home bits of stone, blessed bread, or hand-drawn saints' faces. They hung them in cottages and whispered their stories at bedtime. They weren't doctors. They were carriers of memory. Ghosts in the grain every village had. That one tale. The farmer who never caught the plague, but heard footsteps at night. The baker who left loaves on the windowsills of the dead. The widow who dreamed of her lost husband each night and woke with warm tears on her cheek. These became village legends, passed from grandparent to child, with a wink and a candle. They told of fields that grew again after years of stillness, of churches that echoed with music once more, and yes, even of hearts that dared to love again, because nothing brings back life like a kiss in the ruins. When folklore met fact, here's the beautiful mess of memory. The line between it happened and we believe it did is blurry. Was that plague-proof cat real? Probably not. Did someone beat the fever by sleeping in lavender and muttering to a loaf of bread? Who knows? But did those stories help people sleep at night? Absolutely. Legends wrapped grief in warmth. They made sense of what had none. And they reminded folks that even after horror, a new chapter could begin. Why stories matter. So why are we still whispering these tales tonight? Because they're yours, in a way. Not through bloodlines or family names, but through being human. When things go wrong, we tell stories. To explain, to soothe, to remember. And long after the buboes dried and the bells stopped tolling, people still gathered around fires. They still lit candles, still carved initials in tree trunks, still watched the stars, and whispered, as you drift off tonight, imagine a tiny cottage, its windows flicker with candlelight. Inside, a mother hums softly, while her child holds a little wooden saint. Outside, the wind moves through fields that once knew sorrow, but now, they hum, with crickets and the rustle of wheat. The child asks, will it ever come back? The mother says, maybe, but so will we. Because the Black Death wasn't just disease, it was a test of memory, of love, of how long we could hold on. And the survivors, they whispered, until their whispers became the world again. Chapter 20. Legacy of the Black Death. Okay. We've walked through smoke-filled rooms, danced with skeletons, confessed our sins under candlelight, and watched people whip themselves in the streets. It's been a wild ride through medieval chaos. But now, let's take a breath. The plague didn't just bring death. It also left behind some big, lasting changes. Yep, even the worst disaster in history had an after-party. And surprisingly, it came with new ideas, fresh starts, and the tiniest hint of progress. Let's talk about what stuck around long after the Black Death faded. Spoiler, it's more than just nightmares and creepy murals. Lasting changes in medicine, early quarantines, public health beginnings. Believe it or not, medieval folks did learn a few things from all that horror. Before the plague, medicine was basically herbs, guesswork, and a lot of sweating. But after waves of death rolled across Europe, people started thinking, maybe we should have some rules about disease stuff. Cue the birth of quarantine. The word itself comes from quarantagiorni, meaning 40 days. Cities like Venice started keeping incoming ships at bay, for you guessed it, 40 days, just in case they were carrying passengers with plague fleas. It was like medieval border control with extra paranoia. And guess what? It worked. Kind of. Not always, but enough to make it a thing. Suddenly, towns were setting up isolation houses, pest control officers, plague watchers, and even early versions of health boards. Of course, there was still plenty of guesswork. One guy might suggest burning herbs, another might recommend leeches, and a third just wants everyone to move to the mountains. But the idea that public health mattered, that stuck. It wasn't modern medicine yet, but it was a baby step in the right direction. The Black Death didn't cure anything, but it sure made people take illness seriously. Shifts in religious practice and social order. Now let's talk about how the plague shook everything else, starting with religion. At first, People turned to the church for answers. Why is this happening? What did we do wrong? Is God mad at us? And the church said, it's complicated. When prayers didn't stop the dying, some folks started losing faith. Priests were dying too. Churches closed. People watched holy men drop like everyone else. And suddenly, the idea of divine protection didn't feel so solid. This led to changes. Some folks doubled down on religion, more prayer, more penance, more pilgrimages. Others backed away and said, maybe I should trust my own gut more than the guys in robes. Monasteries emptied. Churchland was sold. And new movements started bubbling up. People wanted a more personal, direct kind of faith. Less showy, more real. At the same time, social order got a makeover. Half the workers were dead. Fields were empty. Whole towns vanished. So guess what the survivors did? They demanded better treatment. Suddenly peasants who used to be ignored were in high demand. If you could work a field or build a wall, people wanted you. Wages went up. Serfs got bald. Landlords panicked. The world tilted just a bit. It wasn't a full revolution, but it cracked the system. The Black Death didn't just kill it, reshuffled the deck. Power shifted. The poor had leverage, and society would never be quite the same again. How a quiet prayer became a new kind of resilience. Okay, now let's slow things down for a second. Not everyone responded to the plague with big changes or loud protests. Some responded with something smaller, something quieter, a whispered prayer, a candle lit in the dark, a small promise to keep going, even when everything felt broken. This kind of quiet faith, not flashy, not loud, became its own kind of strength. It wasn't about huge church ceremonies or wild processions. It was personal, private, and honest. People began to find resilience in small routines, washing hands, avoiding crowds, leaving bread for a sick neighbor, whispering names of lost loved ones during sunset. It didn't feel heroic, but it was. In a world where everything felt like chaos, these tiny acts were like bricks in a wall. Little by little, they helped people rebuild not just homes, but hope. The Black Death taught people that even when things fall apart, you can still hold on. Not with swords or sermons, but with quiet strength. Closing thoughts. What we carry forward from medieval hope amidst horror. So, what do we carry forward from all this? Well, maybe not the rat-infested cities or the questionable bloodletting techniques, but a lot of the human spirit from that time that still sticks with us. We still light candles in memory. We still lean on faith, whatever that looks like, for strength. We still look for answers in dark times, and sometimes ... we still make weird art about it. Shout out to every moody skeleton tattoo and plague doctor meme. The Black Death was one of the worst things to ever hit humanity. But even in the middle of all that pain, people created, prayed, wrote, laughed, worked, and loved. And maybe that's the real legacy, not the death toll, not the bones in mass graves, but the resilience that rose quietly in its place. Because the plague didn't win, people did, with smoke and scribbles and whispered prayers, with iron nails, hand-drawn charms, and maybe even a goofy street performance or two. In the end, medieval hope wasn't loud. It was fragile, but it survived. And that's something worth remembering.